All companies, of course, have policies about dealing with conflict of interest, but also there's an issue about inter-office relationships, and they can be amongst the trickiest. Megan Motto is Chief Executive of the Governance Institute of Australia and joins me now. Megan, many thanks for your time. This is always very difficult. As we say, this is not really necessarily about Fortescue and what's happened there. They've had an investigation. He's completely exonerated and cleared, the company says. But it's really about when you look at different companies, they can have different policies when it comes to managing relationships in the office.
Indeed, indeed. And those policies range, of course. I think the main thing here from a governance perspective is the communication and clarity around what those policy means, and in particular, how they relate to the behaviour in the workplace. We all have a duty to our workplace when we're in the workplace, and it's not unusual to find these relationships. In fact, I think somewhere between 10 and 40% of relationships, depending on what research you read, are developed in the workplace. So in other words, completely usual.
The famous Malcolm Turnbull bonk ban, right, for federal politicians, that's very difficult for any organisation to be able to legally stand up, isn't it?
Yes, it's quite impractical, in fact. We have all sorts of relationships in workplaces. In workplaces, we have these things called human beings, and of course they have all sorts of relationships, close friendship relationships, family relationships on the odd occasion, all sorts. And these intimate relationships are an extension of that. It's really about the behaviour in the workplace that's set through the roles, the policies, the frameworks for the organisation, but really importantly by the culture.
But as much as that, you say it's about the communication. So in other words, if relationships are disclosed, if there is any imbalance of power, and also, of course, what everybody should think about, what happens if something goes wrong?
Indeed, and not just an imbalance of power, but any area where you might present risk to the workplace. So it might be a performance risk because there might be bias that comes into decision-making because of a particular relationship. It might be because of the reputational risk of that imbalance of power. It might be for conflict of interest risk. So there's a range of different risks, including just general HR risk. What happens if the relationship does sour? Does that mean that we enter into sexual harassment territory, bullying territory? You know, what's the fallout and how does it affect the performance of the organisation? Because how does it affect your colleagues around you?
Well, the colleagues around you is a very interesting issue as well, isn't it? Because they become integral either if they don't know about the relationship and discover it, or indeed they know about the relationship and they perceive that there might be some sort of favouritism taking place.
Indeed, indeed. Favouritism or otherwise. Sometimes it can in fact go the other way, that you have a more distant relationship because you're just aware of this relationship in the background. So for the colleagues at work, it's a really difficult one. Do they take the action of disclosing if those individuals have not disclosed themselves? We would say in a governance world, if in doubt, disclose, because it does present a conflict of interest type situation. And the best way to manage a conflict of interest is to have sunlight be the best disinfectant, have the sunlight shine upon the conflict, and then think about mitigants and ways of controlling those risks.
Okay, so I've gone through a whole lot of the general principles and, if you like, the standards of conduct at a variety of companies. They're different. Should they be the same?
No, it's all contextual. Every company is different, and it also depends on the context of the particular relationship. Are the two people in the same office, on the same floor, in the same department? What's the power imbalance? How often do they work together alongside each other? So what's the proximity of the relationship in a work sense as well as then in the relationship sense? So it's very contextually bound from organisation to organisation, some sectors to other sectors, the type of working conditions and the actual relationship involved itself. So judgment really is at the core of a lot of this decision.
Okay, so then is that worth even the paper it's printed on, a code of conduct, once you end up in the Fair Work Commission? Because then different laws apply.
Indeed, but codes of conduct are really useful tools to lay the foundations of expectations. And that's the role that the code of conduct would play in any organisation. So if you have a code of conduct and it talks about transparency in the workplace and the reporting of disclosure of conflicts of interest and other interest in the workplace, then that's a really good start for organisations, because at least there's a framework which you can pin those judgment decisions back to. Did it affect the workplace, for example? Did it affect the work of the individual? Did it affect the work of those around them? we have a duty to the workplace. So making sure that the performance underlying that is there. Also, how does it affect the reputational risk for the organisation? The higher you go up the food chain, the more those risks are material to the organisation.
And that's one of the keys, isn't it? The higher you go, the more material the risk. That is going to be one of the keys. I'm going to say, Megan Motto, great to have you on the program today. There's so many issues around governance, so we'll get you in again shortly.
Wonderful.
Many thanks for your time today.